If you're a classroom teacher and you don't know the difference between a learning disability and a skill deficit, then this is for you. Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm a counselor and a teacher coach, and today I want to talk about the difference between a learning disability and a skill deficit, because having this information is going to make you a way better teacher. So the reason I want to talk about this topic is because as students are virtually learning, we're going to see those gaps just widen so much because they're just not learning the same way, and some students are struggling majorly to get things done. And so we're going to see this huge gap, and I think there's just going to be such a big rise in teachers or parents requesting special ed services because they're seeing such a big gap. But I want to have this conversation because it's very important to know the difference between a student having a learning disability and a skill deficit. When we talk about special education, there's just so much verbiage and so many laws that you need to know. So I want to just break those down for a general ed teacher. Just what do you need to know? What do you need to know to make sure that you have your students back and that you understand how to make a positive impact when you see students that are struggling? So I want to start off with an example. Let's say you have a 6th grade student who falls in the average to high IQ level, but their reading score is at a 2nd grade level. Is that a learning disability or is that a skill deficit? Which one is it? And as a teacher, how would you know? Before we dive a little bit deeper, don't forget to subscribe so that you can be updated with any new videos that we post. Learning disability is a neurological disorder, and usually this is going to make it difficult for students to process information or to store information. And sometimes for students, it's both. They have trouble processing and holding on to information. When it comes to a skill deficit, this is where a student, due to lack of educational opportunities, has major holes or gaps in their learning. So let me give you an example. Let's say a student has been homesick for a very long time and was not able to keep up with the reading or with the practices. They're going to have chunks of missing information. And so if they're homesick and can't do the work, for whatever reasons, there's plenty of reasons why students could be missing school, they're not going to get it. Some students are just missing school because parents are not responsible, or if the kid's older, they're ditching school and they're missing so much information, so there's going to be chunks of information missing there. What about if it's a language issue? The student maybe just started school from another country and they don't know English very well, and so those are going to cause major holes as they're trying to learn the language. It's going to be a while before they're able to actually learn some content. And unfortunately, sometimes some students just fall through the cracks, right? We see that happen sometimes where they're just getting moved on from 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, onto middle school, high school, and nobody stopped and said, wait, this student doesn't know how to read. This student doesn't know, their basic math facts, or student still has a lot of trouble with writing. Like, not just the ideas, but physically the writing aspect of it. And nobody stopped to say, what's going on? And nobody fixed that specific skill. So there's a lot of differences between the two, and so I want to talk about that even more. So when it comes to the long-term impacts of learning disabilities and skill deficits, there's a major difference. When it's a learning disability, the student will never grow out of it. They will always have that learning disability. If the student's dyslexic, they're going to be dyslexic as an adult. If they have autism, they're going to have autism as an adult. Same thing with ADHD and all the other learning disabilities that you're going to see in your classroom. They're always going to have that. You just become an adult that has to learn to adapt. And that's one of the things that special ed is supposed to help them with, is if you have this learning disability, how are you going to be able to perform despite it? Like, how can you help yourself continue to be successful? When it comes to a skill deficit, they could eventually catch up. If we provide the right intervention, a very specific intervention to that skill that they're lacking, then the student can catch up. They won't always have that gap. We can close up that gap that they have, and they can be successful and move on and do well. Not to say that students with a disability cannot be successful. They definitely can, given the right accommodations and the right differentiation. All right, next I want to jump into the differences between IQ, comparing the IQ differences when we talk about students with learning disabilities have a disparity in their IQ and in their performance. And so that's one of the major indicators. As a counselor, when I'm meeting with students and we're deciding on whether we're going to have them be evaluated for special ed or not, that's one of the major things that we look at. Not the only one, because there's other things that you also need to take under consideration. But as a classroom teacher, this should be one of the indicators. So as a classroom teacher, if you're finding that the student is able to articulate pretty well, like a story, or has really good comprehension if you read it to the class, but now when it's time to process the thought into writing, that they can't. They have nice print, it looks great, but the thought is not being put on paper. That's a red flag, right? Because there's such a such a discrepancy between what you can see that they should be able to do and their performance. That's a huge gap. And so when one of the tests that they do is to check the student's IQ and then see how they're performing. So let me give you an example. So a student who is dyslexic, if they're tested, they're gonna most likely qualify because they probably have an average to high IQ, like the 6th grader I mentioned earlier, but their performance is way down here. So he should be reading at a 6th grade level because his IQ says he has that ability to do that, but the performance is down here. And so there is such a huge gap, and that is a huge red flag that something could be up, okay? When it comes to skill deficits, there's usually not a huge gap between their performance and their IQ. They just need a little bit of help in that skill building. So even if we look at the language example that I was talking about earlier, the student can possibly just not do well because it's not in their language. But given in their language, they're going to do well. So that's just a skill deficit. They don't have a neurological disorder. So IQ, again, is not just the only thing to look at, but as a classroom teacher, if you're finding that they do really well in a lot of areas, but in this area, they really lack, that's a red flag that something's up. And one thing to remember also is that if the student has a low IQ and is performing really low, that's accurate. That means that they're at their peak performance level. So if a student is a 10th grader and has a low IQ and they're reading like at a 3rd grade level, that might be the student's level because of their low IQ. So it doesn't mean that there's a learning disability. It just means that maybe that's their performance level, and you want to keep that in mind also. When it comes to performance, and that's kind of the same thing that I was already talking about, is, when you have a student with autism, let's say, they might have an average to high IQ, but you're not seeing that performance of what you're asking them to do in the classroom, right? A lot of students with autism could have receptive or expressive language issues, and so they have to be able to show you what they know in a different way. So you would have to create some kind of accommodations or modifications for that student so that they can show you what they can do, and keeping those things in mind. When it's a skill deficit, you find that they continue to have a difficult time articulating their thoughts. They just never learn those skills. So if you're able to provide intervention with those, you'll be able to see a boost in that performance. So it just varies, right, with the performance. Like a dyslexic student having a difficult time with reading, but doing well with articulating after you watched a video. Again, that discrepancy is going to be there. And so you want to keep an eye out for those kind of things with your students. For our next part, I want to talk about RTI. And RTI came in 2004 when IDEA was reissued, right? So what they were finding is that every time there was a student who wasn't performing at benchmark, they were just sending students over to be tested for special ed. And so that was happening a lot. So the special ed was like totally backlogged with all these students, and a lot of them were not qualifying. And it was like, well, what's going on? Why aren't these students qualifying? So RTI, response to intervention, is important to have at your site. And if they don't, as a teacher, you need to be doing this. The intervention is so important. So if you're providing intervention for a student who has a learning disability, you're not going to see much growth, not in a general ed classroom. If a student is dyslexic and you're practicing reading over and over and over, you might see some improvement, but there's not going to be significant growth. Now, a kid that has a skill deficit, you're going to see significant growth when you are very focused on that skill that they're lacking. So this RTI part, this is where the teachers are really important. This is where you have to really look at what you have in your classroom and how can you help these students and make sure that you're keeping notes on what intervention you're trying. Going back to our example of our 6th grader who was average to high IQ but performing at a 2nd grade level, there are 3 takeaways I want you to take away from today. Number 1 is to provide the student with interventions that are very specific and measurable. For instance, I always do 6 to 8 weeks. In 6 to 8 weeks of very honed in intervention, we should be able to see some growth. And if we don't, that's a red flag. So you want to do SMART goals for that student. So for instance, for a student like that, it would be very specific to be reading with that student at their level and finding out where are those gaps of reading, and then finding those skills that they need to be able to slowly grow and move them forward. And you should be able to see growth. If you're not seeing growth, that's a red flag. So you have to keep data on it, very specific data on what is it that you're doing and what did you see? What was the outcome of that intervention? Number 2, keep data of all your intervention and how the student responded. This is going to be very important because what's going to happen is if you are going to now ask special ed to evaluate the student, they're going to probably tell you to go back and provide intervention for a few weeks before they're going to test the student. So to avoid that and now spending more time with the student not getting the right support, just start providing intervention even before that. You don't have to wait for somebody to tell you to provide intervention. Just do it. Do your small groups, do one-on-one with the student, and then the important part, keep the data. What did you do? What specific skill did you work on with that student? And number 3, the student does not need an IEP or a 504 for interventions or differentiation. Whether it's a learning disability or a skill deficit, if you see a student struggling, you don't need to wait for somebody to tell you to provide accommodations or differentiation. Good teaching is jumping in there, doing the one-on-one with them, doing some kind of intervention with them, a small group. All of those great strategies are going to help these students, and they don't need to have a 504 and IEP for you to do that. If you feel that they need that, do it. And if you're doing all these interventions and not seeing growth, that's when you reach out and say, hey, something's up. I've been trying all these different methods and I'm not seeing much growth, or there's been very minimal growth and I need to see more. If you want to learn more about how to differentiate, check out this link. I did a video a while ago on just specifically on differentiation, and if you need to hear more on that, that's a video you should check out. So leave a comment below. I want to know what questions you have about the difference between learning disabilities and skill deficits. I want to be able to help you out if you have some questions or specific questions about who you have in your classroom. So if you found this video helpful, please make sure you hit that like button. If you'd like me to work with you, check out my website at cindyrosa.com for some information on how I can help you out one-on-one.